As far as I know, no other program is using the same method of teaching. Can you make that real for the applicant? What is a raw case?
The raw case is big and messy and involves a lot of different components.
What are some other ways that you think Yale really differentiates itself as an institution relative to others?
One thing I would point to is definitely our sort of global approach.
The vast majority of students will take at least one course outside of SOM during the time they're there, and there's actually no upper limit. Your entire second year, theoretically, could be taken outside of SOM.
How does the Yale School of Management differentiate itself from many other top business schools in the United States and abroad? What makes the Yale SOM community so special? And how can you, as an applicant, best engage with the Yale community? Today, we're answering those questions and more with two people who know the school best: Assistant Deans for Admissions, Bruce DelMonico, and Laurel Grodman. Let's start by discussing how Yale defines its mission of business and society. Thanks for joining us, Bruce and Laurel. An interesting thing about Yale, to me at least, is that there's this long heritage from prior to it being an MBA program that still kind of follows it today, the motto being business and society. And I remember talking to you, Bruce. This is dating back at least...
Dating us?
Dating us, yes. Probably close to 15 years ago.
Okay.
At the first AGAC conference. And I was talking to you about Yale being a nonprofit school and like that kind of reputation. You said to me, basically every school is a consulting school if you really think about it. If you think about that plurality of where individuals go after graduation, most schools do their finance or consulting schools with the emphasis being on consulting. I guess this long-winded question is, does that heritage still inform the school today, and how, or is the Yale SOM really a general management consulting finance school like most other programs?
I don't know if I can say yes. In the sense that I think it's both. I think the mission to educate leaders for business and society still informs and animates what we do in the classroom, outside the classroom as graduates. I think that said, I think of it as kind of an and plus. We have the strength in consulting, strength in finance, but then the diversity of the other things that people are doing, I think are really, really where kind of a lot of the magic is. And I think even when, I think you've talked about this, even within consulting, the diversity of what our students are doing, it's not just the big three, but we have, people going to Bridgespan, people doing environmental consulting, people doing education consulting. So even within the consulting sphere, there's a broad diversity in terms of those outcomes.
So is it fair to say that Yale is still true to that heritage? There's still a very strong ethos throughout the community, and that's something that is embraced as opposed to, hey, let's be like, yes, we can be balanced about it, but we are fundamentally still embracing that heritage?
I think so. I think, this founding mission just continues to become more and more relevant. I think, Yale is about business and society, when I think the and society part wasn't necessarily as cool in the business school space. It was a little quirkier. And I think in some ways the market has caught up to us. I think the idea of impact and purpose is on a lot of candidates' minds now. And that's, they want to enter environments and communities where that matters, where it's about more than just the bottom line. And I think that's just always been in our DNA and in our ethos. And it continues, I think, to animate everybody who comes to the program, whether it's students or faculty or staff. In fact, we were talking a little bit earlier. I was remembering a conversation when our I say new dean, not so new anymore, but our dean, Kerwin Charles, was new. And he first came and was sort of doing a listening tour of students and alumni and faculty and staff. And he asked everyone, what does the mission mean to you? And I remember being in a room of 15 or so people and going around, and every single person had a slightly different take on it. But there's something so SOM-y about that, right? Everyone is sort of, again, animated by this idea that it's a purpose-driven place, that it's, it's giving you the tools to solve society and business's big thorny challenges. But everyone plugs into that into a slightly different way.
Do you want to learn more about your target business schools? Check out On Track by mbaMission, where we have in-depth modules on all the top business schools, covering everything from what makes them unique to how to tackle the application essays and short answers, and so much more. You can also practice for interview and video questions, all done on your schedule, on demand. We appreciate your dedication to our podcast, and we want to offer you 30% off any on-track subscription. Use the code MBAMPOD to get 30% off any on-track subscription. Check it out at ontrack.mbaMission.com. How can you make that real for the applicant who will become a student one day? If you're a student, what are you getting at the Yale SOM that kind of expresses this mission or manifests this mission through activities, courses, whatever it might be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's kind of multiple layers. I think the academic experience, the integrated curriculum, when you look at the way the courses are taught, the core curriculum is taught in a very different way. A lot of the same materials taught that you would get at other business schools, but the way that it is reoriented, the way that we're pulling in from different disciplines. It's not just business concepts, but political science, sociology, psychology, medicine, law, the environment, all those different disciplines. Faculty from different parts of the university are coming in to team teach. So I think that academic experience and the way that the material is oriented along stakeholder perspectives as opposed to being just kind of functionally discrete silos. And so I think that's part of it. I think, outside the classroom, the way the experience is structured, especially the integration to the larger Yale community. I think when you come to Yale SOM, you come to Yale, I think that's very meaningful. The entire university tries to be as navigable as possible. And so it's not just, SOM that tries to reach out to the rest of the university, but when you come to SOM, you can take classes elsewhere, but you'll have students from other parts of the university taking classes at SOM. In the SOM classroom, you will, in terms of clubs and conferences, I think we have the healthcare conference coming up, for example, and that is led by and run by SOM students along with students from the medical school,
right,
and public health and the nursing school, and our MBA students who are also doing the public health track. So, Sci City, for example, which is about the Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, and that is a kind of a hub, like it's a makerspace, but it's also an innovation hub, and you can students from across the university, Yale College, law school, medical school, engineering, elsewhere, all coming together. And I think that sort of really broad-minded interdisciplinary way of thinking is indicative of and is representative of that mission for business and society. And I think the way that the academic experience is structured, the way the co-curricular experience is structured, really, I think does kind of elevate that.
Right.
And I could give you an example of how it worked in practice for me. It's so intentional how all of this is put together. It sounds like there's just so much opportunity and maybe we're just throwing spaghetti at the wall, but I think it really is cleverly constructed to reflect how post-MBA jobs exist nowadays. Mm-hmm. I think there was a point in time decades ago where you entered a particular role within an organization. You pretty much were in that functional specialty for years and years before you had any kind of general management oversight or interdisciplinary exposure. And that's just not the way of it anymore. Most of our students are coming into the program having already been sort of thrown into the fire and exposed to kind of multiple complex problems across many dimensions. And so I worked at Unilever after graduating from SOM, and I was a marketer. I worked in brand management. But most of the problems that I was solving were not strictly speaking marketing problems. I had to think about, in fact, I worked very closely with factories and the communities in which those factories operated and how the decisions we were making at the plant level had broader implications, for the towns and the communities that those factories operated in. We worked on sustainability initiatives. That wasn't strictly speaking a marketing question, but thinking about how do we change our packaging to make it more sustainable and what are the cost implications for that? What are the transportation implications? And so I very quickly saw that even though I called myself a marketer in a sense, I was a general manager pretty much from day one after graduating from an MBA program. And that's where I think Yale's really intentional interdisciplinary approach starts to hit.
And I think we're here also to talk about differentiation. I think that dovetails nicely with the point of major differentiation for Yale, which uses raw cases, which, as far as I know, no other program is using the same method of teaching. Can you make that real for the applicant? What is a raw case?
Sure. So it's hard to define a raw case without the counterpoint, which is a cooked case, which is sort of your traditional business school case, which we also produce and use. But So a traditional cook case is usually told from the point of view of a protagonist of a particular story or situation. And it lays out in a pretty linear fashion what a discrete chain of events look like. And it's a great tool to allow a class to focus in on a particular problem or a particular concept. So it's very helpful in that sense. By contrast, a raw case is big and messy and involves a lot of different components. It is versus a cook case, which theoretically could be printed out and sort of portable. A raw case spans multimedia, so they're all entirely based online. And there will be interviews with primary, participants in the situation. There will be financial statements. There'll be media clippings, and all sorts of components thrown in there. And nobody's telling you what is useful or what is not useful to the problems that you're trying to solve. It is like your job in real life, where you have to sift through a lot of information and identify what are the relevant pieces, sometimes contradictory pieces, that I need to sift through to figure out whatever the particular problem it is that the class is focused on. And the really cool thing about it is they're so kind of big and immersive, you can actually look at the same case from multiple different perspectives. So occasionally different courses will actually use the same case, and you'll look at it through the lens of one of the courses, and then all of a sudden you'll switch to the other one, and you'll be like, oh, I wasn't really paying attention to that particular set of information, but now I see where it's relevant, and maybe it's even made me change my mind about that first question that I answered. So again, much more reflective of how you encounter challenges in your real life jobs, where you don't just sort of have everything sewn up at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is beyond the purview of our discussion, but that's okay. I think of that as being very much the future of education. I think that today's students are not, they've got a lot of media coming their way. They've got a lot of information, and they're maybe not quite as good, like me, not quite as good as sitting still and just kind of reading for an extended period of time or listening for an extended period of time. So I think this kind of many inputs, many information sources is really quite forward looking. And I think it'll, it's not that it needs to gain traction. Clearly it has, but I think that it'll only increase in popularity with time. Just for, not supposed to play favorites, but I think this is a great way of learning.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of that too, it is, as Laurel said, it's really teaching our students a skill that will serve them well. It's a critical skill for them to have after they graduate, in terms of how to understand information, how to absorb information, how to make sense of incomplete facts or conflicting facts. In the Cook cases, our case writing team, Jan Elias, who leads our case writing team, came from HBS, was a case writer there, and he basically said the way raw cases are created, they do all the same research they would do for a cooked case, but then for a cooked case, they would distill it all down and kind of give it to the students. And for a raw case, they just give all that research to the students, and then the students have to make sense of it. And I think that's really, really important.
Right. So, okay, so we've got our raw cases, we've got our integrated curriculum. What are some other ways that you think Yale really differentiates itself as an institution relative to others?
I think one thing I would point to is definitely our sort of global approach. A lot of business schools, especially U.S. business schools, aim to be global in nature, and I think for them, it tends to be, semester-long exchange program, or it tends to happen more on the MBA level than on the full-time MBA level. But, about a decade ago, Yale SOM created this global network for advanced management, which now has its own life, it's its own thing. But the idea was to connect, roughly 30 top business schools from around the globe and create opportunities for students from those schools to interact on a peer-to-peer basis. And there are global network weeks, there are virtual global classes, there are other opportunities in addition to semester-long exchanges and other things to really connect those students from those 30 schools with each other. And the idea is, we aspire to be a global school, and we want our students, even if they're working in a very local sort of role, to understand the different forces that exist around the world and how businesses and other organizations operate differently in different contexts. And so that's a critical part of our education. But I think creating a platform, creating opportunities for our students to have those unique experiences, I think really informs what the Yale SOM kind of education is about.
So is that global network, is that something that people have to opt into? Is it baked into the experience? Is it something that becomes an opportunity at certain points? Can you do it from day one?
There's actually a global studies requirement. So every student has to have at least one deep global engagement during the time they're at SOM, which is funny to kind of call it a requirement because I think it tends to be a highlight of people's academic experience and one that they would want to opt into anyway. But the global network serves as the platform for a number of those opportunities. So there are international experience trips, which are actually coming up in probably a week or two over spring break, where you take a half semester long course and it culminates in a trip to one of, I think it's probably 8 or 9 different geographies led by a professor, and you meet with local politicians and business leaders and really get sort of immersed in that culture. There are global network weeks, which take place in the various global network schools, usually in an area of that school's faculty expertise. And the really neat thing there is you're sitting in a classroom with maybe 3 or 4 other Yale students, but with a truly kind of global classroom among you from all of the different global network schools there. So those are a couple of the opportunities. One other thing, which I have to be honest, I don't know if it's been phased out, but just maybe a demonstration of how prescient this idea was that global engagement sort of is the future. A course called Global Virtual Teams. I don't know if you know if it still exists.
I think it's not in the spring of the core, but it's elsewhere.
So global virtual teams pre-pandemic seemed like this really oddball thing. So it put together a group of students in these little kind of pods of, an SOM student and students from some of the other global network schools. And they basically had a week or two to work through a project and navigate all the differences of time zones and how do you meet when you're not in the same physical location. Stuff that sounds ridiculous now that we're 5 or 6 years later, and we all have to do this all the time. But how prescient it was to recognize that being able to interact in those sorts of teams and get things done across space and time and cultural differences and all of those kinds of things, I think has become more of the bread and butter of our Zoom lives now.
Right. Yeah. Although it's someone who still has 5 years and has trouble getting the Zoom audio right, like that. Well, those kinds of issues never go out of style.
You should have taken global virtual teams.
I think
you would have been set.
I always say Zoom is what it's 2 buttons, and I still get them wrong 80% of the time. Is the audio on?
I think there's at least 3.
Yeah, you're muted. You're muted. No.
I think we're touching upon in talking about the global teams and the global network, just a fairly distinct community at Yale, and a community that's very much punctuated by teamwork. I mean, can you again sort of make that real, make that anecdotal for the applicant to the individual who knows nothing but keeps hearing the buzzword of team or the buzzword of community? What does that mean at Yale, at the SOM?
I think teams are very both intentional and spontaneous in a way at SOM. So the intentional part comes, the class is broken up into 5 cohorts of, I should be able to do the math in my head, probably 75 or so a pop. And those groups are somewhat intentionally constructed to be something of a microcosm of a whole. So you have different representation of backgrounds and educational experiences and all those sorts of things within each of those groups. And then within there, you have a learning team, which is also determined by outside forces. And again, meant to bring people in with different skill sets. And not everyone was an undergrad finance major and not everyone, worked in consulting beforehand, but to have, again, a little bit of a sprinkling of different backgrounds and interests coming together. And you work through all of your core classes with that learning team. And you have to learn not only through the problem sets or the subject matter that you're engaging in, but you have to learn how to work together. You have to learn how to get things done with this group of people that you didn't necessarily select yourself. But those end up becoming very, very tight groups for the most part, and people that, for better or worse, you've gotten through a really rigorous curriculum from, how many countless hours of problem sets solved and so on. So that's one of the more sort of intentional kind of team working experiences. But there's so many that come together organically, whether it's just people that you happen to study with frequently, or through the clubs and the sort of affinity-based kind of connections that people make. And so, not surprisingly, people come to SOM like to join and be involved and contribute to their community. And so I think these these teams take on maybe a more amorphous structure in some of those areas. You mentioned the healthcare conference.
Yeah.
That's an incredibly, large and robust team, and I'm sure sub-teams working together within the School of Management with the other schools that are involved in it across Yale, and have to again make decisions as peers and partners, and navigate in that way. It happens at City Center for those who are doing entrepreneurial work across the university. So I think that the core experience in the classroom is the more designed and developed one, but lots of team working throughout.
Yeah. But I would say even in the classroom, so obviously there are the learning teams, there are the co-curricular experiences. The first class you take at SOM is called Managing Groups and Teams. So you start orientation, even within orientation, before the rest of the curriculum starts. That's the first class you take, and it's about learning how to be a good team leader, be a good team member, and that leads, that kind of kicks off the leadership curriculum, and you have the course like interpersonal dynamics and others that kind of teach you, and even within the core curriculum, the course called the workforce, which used to be called employee, we were talking about this, but has been kind of relabeled and I think reoriented a little bit, and it's one of those stakeholder perspectives that gets at being within a team and how that plays out.
And in some ways, communities are abstract and they're their own thing, but in some ways they can be shaped by design and by space. And Yale has this absolutely phenomenal campus. I mean, can you talk about the role the campus plays in the experience? Like it kind of sounds superficial at times, being like the building, but I mean, there's design for a reason, and it's such a spectacular space. Can you just share how it influences the community experience?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start because I experienced the old SOM building, which was wonderful and charming for our little close-knit community, but we had vastly outgrown it even by the time I was there. And so I got to sort of experience that shift from the old to the new. And in addition to it just being kind of larger in scale, I think it suits the needs of the school so well, and suits the sort of the ethos of the school. So the thing that is most striking to me is that it's glass, right? So there's glass everywhere, and it's very modern, which is different from a lot of the buildings that's sort of old school Yale. But the one thing it holds in common with many, many Yale buildings is it has this beautiful internal courtyard. And so it's surrounded by glass, and you could be on one side of the courtyard and look across, and you can see your friends studying up there. You could see your professor walking down there and said, I need to catch up with them. Whatever it might be, it's this idea of transparency, right? It's not of these, it isn't sort of things happening in darkness and in, cramped corner. It's just, it absorbs the community around it. It's light and airy, and I think it's an inspiring place to study. And again, it facilitates connections, because you'd be surprised how much time you just sort of sit back and start staring around in those glass rooms. We call some of them the fish bowls because they just seem like fish bowls, but kind of encourages connection, I think, having that sort of sense of transparency and light.
Yeah, and I think there were actually echoes to the previous campus. It was charming is a nice euphemism for shabby.
So diplomatic.
It was well worn.
Yeah, well worn. They were these stately kind of very Ivy League mansions, but they were not well suited for the purpose. But there was one feature of it, which I'm sure you recall, the Hall of Mirrors, which is from a design perspective horrible, because it was this choke point that required everybody to walk past. So in between classes, everybody was running into each other, and it was called the Hall of Mirrors because one wall was an actual mirror. But the thing was, it did foster community because everybody saw everybody else. You were able to, it was kind of like a congregation point. And actually, as we were doing, because I remember years ago when we were doing focus groups and Norman Foster and his team were just asking students and staff and faculty what they wanted from the new building. And almost universally, the Hall of Mirrors was referred to as a positive, even though from a design standpoint it was not a positive. And I think that's part of what the building tries to capture is that sense of community and the sense of being in a place, seeing each other, the transparency, the visibility. You can look across the building, see people, meet people, and I think that's an important part of the experience.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also very open to the rest of Yale. So we have a really good cafe and cafeteria. Food brings people together, right? So I think people, even not from the SOM community, make it a destination. And that's where a lot of interaction happens. Yeah.
It's a good opportunity to go back to the previous conversation about how the SOM is integrated into the community. Do you have any stats on the percentage, let's say, of students in the SOM who take classes elsewhere? Is it 30? Is it 80? Just to give people a sense.
It's definitely the majority. I mean,
Yeah.
it fluctuates year to year, but the vast majority of students will take at least one course outside of SOM during the time they're there. And there's actually no upper limit. Your entire second year theoretically could be taken outside of SOM. I don't think that happens all that frequently, but people really do take advantage of it. And at every school you can imagine. It's not as I think the most popular kind of department to take courses in right now is computer science, which sort of makes sense. I think people want to be able to speak the language, even if they themselves are not going to be a software developer. But people take classes at the law school, the School of Drama, the School of the Environment, Public Health, really all reaches of Yale. And we do have a fair number of joint degree students as well. I think we have at this point 9, maybe 10 joint degree programs across Yale, and probably about 10% of our students are engaged in that. So that naturally brings some connection in as well. We call the walls of our glass walls of SOM porous, because there's a lot of opportunity for people to come in and out, and having people from the other schools at Yale sitting in on the Yale SOM classes is really nice too, because it brings a different perspective.
Another community we haven't talked about yet is the alumni community. Mm-hmm. How does the SOM engage its alumni? How active are they? I mean, again, these are always abstract things for applicants.
Yeah.
They're hard to make tangible. Is there a way to make that tangible?
I have an example. So I actually spent my first 4 years working at SOM in our career development office, and so I worked with students on how to conduct a job search, how to source information about opportunities that you might be interested in. And I remember I would always give the advice to the students I spoke to: don't send outreach emails to 10 SOM alums on a Monday, because probably 8 of them are going to get back to you within the next 2 days. And then the other 2 were on vacation and we'll get back to you the next week. And you're going to have to manage all of that follow-up. You don't have time to have 10 informational interviews within a week. So, pace yourself a little bit. But I feel like that's telling of sort of the SOM alum ethos. It's a group that are very, very involved, giving back in all kinds of ways, whether it's informational interviews with students or coming back to be speakers in a professor's classroom, or we have very active alumni board of advisors. We have one on the West Coast and in China and Mexico who are deeply invested in sort of the future of the school. And so, SOM is a relatively young school, and it's a relatively small school, which is not in favor of numbers, but I feel like the group makes up for it in sort of enthusiasm and passion. And then beyond that, there's the Yale University alumni group, which is, a little bit of one step removed, but I find that our students have enormous success in that outreach as well, under sort of the umbrella of One Yale. And that's an alumni group that spans, the globe in pretty much any industry that you can think of.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that, obviously that manifests itself in lots of different ways, and obviously most notably probably on the recruiting front. But I even, it's very that larger Yale network. I remember a few years ago being down in Mexico City and having dinner with a few of our SOM alumni, and they invited some others to the dinner, and it was, a couple of Yale law grads, a couple of med school grads, some Yale college grads. There were about a dozen of us around the table, and all incredibly impressive alumni, but it was just the Yale connection, and they were all networked to each other because of that connection.
You got me thinking, remember when we went to that Yield event? This has got to be 7 or 8 years ago in New York.
With Tom Wolfe?
With Tom Wolfe, exactly. Tom Wolfe in his white suit showed up. He just showed up.
He lived in the building. He's like, I just came down to say hi.
Wow. He didn't RSVP. It was just Tom Wolfe doesn't RSVP.
We should have been I'm sorry, were you invited?
Are you interested in an MBA, Mr. Wolfe?
That's unbelievable. That's really something. Well, that completely threw me off.
Sorry.
We're going off track now.
No, that's great. Those are the impromptu anecdotes that make a podcast work. Is there any particular really strong pocket of alums? You mentioned Mexico City. Are you people would be surprised to know that we have, I'm making it up, 200 alums in Mexico City, or whatever it is. Yeah. Is there some place that you're wow, we've got a stronghold in there that's maybe disproportionate?
I would actually say the West
I was gonna
Coast
say
might
that,
be
yeah.
the surprise, because you
that.
think of, I think there's still somewhat of a regional kind of thought process that happens with business school selection, which I think is becoming more and more moot now that so much recruiting happens virtually anyway. But there's always been a really strong presence on the West Coast for SOM alums. And this is a nice example, maybe even beyond the SOM sort of alumni group, but media and entertainment. When you think about the Yale University network there are so many people who come from all sorts of different disciplines in the area of media and entertainment. There's a really kind of powerful group out there called Yale in Hollywood. It's actually powerful. It's actually it's a large group, and a lot of people from screenwriters all the way through people on the more business side of media and entertainment. But that's kind of a group hosted out of Yale College. But if you are an MBA student interested in media and entertainment, you're always going to be in the minority of whatever school you're in. But that's where having, I think, a really powerful, broader network within Yale really helps. So, and then obviously lots of people on the West Coast interested in tech as well.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about mission and differentiation and community. I guess the last question, the most obvious question is, how can an applicant engage with this community in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think there are lots of different ways to do that. Obviously, we have, as an admissions office, we've tried to create an environment where you could reach out to students. We have our student ambassadors on our website who are available to speak about their experience at Yale SOM, and they're kind of identified by their backgrounds, their interests. So if you can find someone who kind of aligns with what you're interested in doing or where you're coming from. Our student clubs are very accessible and always willing to kind of share what they're doing. We, as an admissions office, have also created lots of opportunities, events, especially virtually, student panels. I do in office hours, so you can connect with me to the extent, not so much you.
No.
No. So you can connect with me. We have Q&A sessions. Again, sort of student, I think I mentioned student panels, other formats to get to know more about what the school is about. And you can obviously also come to campus if you happen to be in the area, although there's no obligation to do that, and it's not going to advantage or disadvantage you in the admissions process if you do come or don't come.
Summer socials, winter socials. So our students like to show off the school as well. So when they go home, whether it's for winter break or summer break, they hold, socials, and you probably know better than I do how many cities across the world, really. And that's an opportunity, a much less formal setting to get to know, off books, what some of our students are up to.
Yeah.
I have to learn to not say my last question because there's always another question. But I think you said something that's important that we accentuate, which is it used to be sort of old orthodoxy, like, if you're interested in school, you got to go visit, you got to show your interest. And you're saying, hey, that may not be that may not be true anymore. I'm sure you're happy to see people, but you don't feel like people necessarily. There are enough other avenues for people to get to the school that you feel like they can do that without putting their feet on the ground.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think, and we feel like. We can talk about this, but a good bit of what we do in the admissions process is try to think about what's fair and what will not advantage or disadvantage different individuals and different groups. And so, it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's difficult to come to campus or even come to an in-person event around the globe. And there's so many, especially post-COVID, there's so many opportunities to do that virtually. And so we really do feel like whatever you do, it should be for you, for your purposes, for your information gathering, for your knowledge, and not anything for us or for to satisfy some I don't know, some hidden requirement that we have.
We actually, a number of years ago, we used to, not by design, but just sort of in the massive information that we would see when reading an application, we would see someone's sort of visit history or interaction history. And we just made the choice at some point to just eliminate it from the view of anyone who's interacting with an application, because it was just irrelevant. And rather than even have the risk of it kind of seeping in and making a difference, so we truly do not see what someone has done to, interact with the school. It's really entirely for candidates' benefit. Mm-hmm. So we hope that they find it engaging when they do that, but we don't know whether you did it or not. Okay,
awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing all these anecdotes and stories and personal experiences about the community, the space, the raw case, so much more. This was really a lot of fun and very informative for all of the applicants who are watching. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
If you want to be one of our success stories, sign up for a free consultation with a member of our full-time MBA admissions team. Since we've worked with tens of thousands of applicants over the past 2 decades, we can give you our honest opinion on your chances and help you put together your very best application. That is not a sales call, but rather your first session with one of us for free. We can give you a profile evaluation, answer specific questions about the process, review your resume, talk about your school choices, and so much more. Sign up at mbaMission.com/consult. We look forward to working with you.